I just think it's a gift. There's not one member of staff that hasn't been self-critical in one time in their life or avoided, emotion. Some of my colleagues and when we look at our own things that we've avoided, you go into the caring profession, and maybe the function of that going into a caring profession is that you don't have to look at your own stuff. Compassionate mind training starts with us. We very much value starting from the inside out and being vulnerable ourselves and sharing that amongst the team, so that we've got an understanding of how difficult it is. Yeah. So we're not asking our clients or residents to do something that we wouldn't be prepared to do ourselves. And so supervision is based on, of course, traditional supervision, but we also have supervision which looks at our own compassion for ourselves.
Welcome back to the podcast. Today it's Alex, and I'm going to be speaking with Lisa Williams. Lisa Williams is the principal clinical psychotherapist and the manager at the Anxiety Disorders Residential Unit at the Bethlehem Hospital. And really what the Anxiety Disorders Unit does is they take patients who have very severe cases of conditions like OCD, social phobia and body dysmorphic disorder, and they enroll them in a 12 to 16 week residential program where they undergo, among other things, intensive CBT, occupational therapy, and various programs which are designed to treat their conditions, which can be quite severe. So in this podcast, we'll talk about how they work at the Anxiety Disorders Residential Unit, how CBT works. We'll talk a little bit about the nature of conditions like OCD and anxiety, and also how these conditions can interact with trauma. And we'll also talk about the role of compassion-focused therapy, which Lisa also practices, and many other topics. In other news, I'm very happy to announce that the podcast will be undergoing a rebranding. We'll have a new name and a new logo. This is a marketing decision which was made with the team, including with our strategist Rosie, who's been working very hard behind the scenes to make the podcast as good as it can be. The show itself is essentially going to remain the same. It will continue to grow and evolve slowly over time, as it always has. But as I said before, it's going to have a new name and a new logo. So if you're a regular listener and you don't want to miss any new episodes, make sure you follow or subscribe on your podcast player, because it's going to look completely different. From April 14th, the show will officially be called the Thinking Mind Podcast. I'd like to thank Maudsley Learning, who have been immensely helpful in helping us make the podcast so far, and will continue to work with us as partners as we continue to make the show as good as it can be. As always, to new listeners of the podcast, welcome. On the show, you can access in-depth conversations about mental health, psychology, psychiatry, psychotherapy. To our OG listeners, welcome back. And now here's today's conversation with Lisa Williams at the Anxiety Disorders Residential Unit at the Bethlehem Hospital. Hello everyone, we're back. Today it's Alex, and I'm very happy to be here with Lisa Williams. Lisa, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
We're on location at the Anxiety Disorders Residential Unit, which is quite a special service, I think, within the South London and Maudsley NHS Trust. So you've just shown me around, so maybe you could tell our listeners a bit about what the unit does, what kind of problems it deals with.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I feel very fortunate to work here, and I think part of that is because of the location is incredible. We're set within the grounds of the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, which is a very special site. As you saw, we're surrounded by greenery and nature and beautiful orchards and woodland. So, and the houses, we have 2 houses. It's a residential inpatient unit, and we receive referrals from all over the country. So we're a national specialist unit that treats anxiety disorders. And what we mean by anxiety disorders is predominantly OCD, obsession compulsive disorder, body dysmorphic disorder, emetophobia, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And basically people are referred from all over the country and they come to us for specialist CBT treatment and other treatments, which I guess we can talk about a bit further down the line, Alex. Yeah. And they live with us for 16 weeks. And we're an unstaffed unit, which is quite unusual. So between 9 and 5, we're staffed, and then we all go home at 5 o'clock. A lot of the residents say that's where the magic happens, because they get to socialise together, to share together, to cook together and to eat together. And also they are able to go out to local services or to go further afield into London and really start connecting with the world around them. And for many of them that have led very isolating lives, it's a real change, but really beneficial for them and their treatment.
Mm-hmm. So there's a combination of highly specialized treatment. Obviously, they're residents here, they're getting treatment daily, but then they're given quite a lot of autonomy, because outside of 9 to 5, they're kind of left to take care of themselves. And I guess they're in a community because they're with each other.
Absolutely. And so we have a lot of the groups that we hold, and the individual therapy is held within the lovely unit that we have here. But also they have access to the occupational therapy department on the Bethlehem site. As you probably know, we've got a museum and we've got an art gallery. And so we're very linked in with the art gallery on site, and we do pottery, and so we have lots of opportunities for engaging in lots of sort of meaningful activities, both within our unit and on site in general.
So it's quite a holistic program that these patients enter.
Definitely. We're looking at the whole person and their families and carers and their communities in which they live in. So within the 16 weeks, we do home visits often with their own therapist, but with occupational therapy. And we go to meet their care teams in their local environment. We go to see them within the context of their own family environment and their home environment, to see actually maybe for many people that come to ADRU, it might be a very different environment. And then we get to see the full picture of them in their own communities at home, which can be quite difficult and challenging. So we're able to work quite closely with them, with their partners, with their children, because as you know, anxiety disorder is not just within that person, it affects many people outside of themselves. But also working closely with the OT to really re-engage people back into a life that they feel that a values-driven life, which is incredible. So we get, they may start off by working in the charity shop in West Wickham, and we've got lots of links with the local charity shops, and then we'd get them linked up with the charity shops within their own home environments as well. That's just an example, but I guess, we are looking very holistically at the person.
Do you see a common arc that patients go through? Obviously, everyone's going to have their individual journey, but are there commonalities when someone gets here at first? Is it typically quite daunting? What does it look like? What does the path typically look like for someone that comes here?
I would say this is one part of ADRU, which I think is really key, is that we have residents that have gone through treatment here that are actually on the volunteer programme. So we've got a lovely volunteer called Keith, who actually suffers with OCD, but had treatment here and now comes back as a volunteer. And he really makes a huge difference to the trajectory of someone's stay, because he's meeting with them in the early stages of his treatment. He's able to talk to the clients about the same fears he had that they may share. And if people are really anxious about coming in, he also rings them before they come in. And he has that really sort of, I'm Keith, I've been through what you're probably going through. I will meet you if you need to within the first week, and we'll have a conversation. And then he comes every week. So he's actually now he left here and went to City Lit, and we've got very strong links with City Lit in London, and he's now doing pottery and ceramics, and he comes back and teaches pottery and ceramics at ADRU as well. So we've got that link, which I think is really helpful. We've also got a carers group, which is really helpful. But what I would say is, Keith would say we had to really encourage him to stay the first few hours at ADRU, and then the first 24 hours, and then he didn't want to leave. So I would say a lot of people don't want to come in initially because they may have read stuff about exposure and response prevention. They may be really scared about being around other residents, sharing bathrooms, all of those things. But within a few days, I think they're really involved in the community, and there's a lot of community support. So we meet people's courage with compassion. That's sort of the ethos of the community, which is lovely. So they're given a buddy, somebody that's been here before. We have daily intentions every morning at 8:00. So we all meet there. We've got a lovely housekeeper, Lisa, who wakes everybody up in the morning just and checks in on their night. So we're really trying to create an environment which is not only safe, but increases psychological safeness. And I think that's a lot to do with us all holding everybody together as a team, rather than just having your individualized therapist. Everybody knows everything and how we can best support you. So that's both residents and therapists know what each other's struggling with. And so when we notice somebody making a move towards things that they really struggle with, we're able to reward them in the moments and meet that courage with compassion, so they're more likely to do it again. The other things to say is that often people come in, it's an anxiety disorder unit, so they come in, highly anxious, very sort of internally focused maybe. And we see over time getting back into their bodies using yoga and soothing rhythm breathing and using compassion. All of those things help people to really sort of stabilize and ensure that actually threat doesn't rule the show. And what I think is a really key moment is when they start to notice, oh, aren't those flowers outside beautiful? Aren't the birds in the trees beautiful? And suddenly it's moved from internal focus to external focus. And that's, for me, it's like amazing to see that. But also I think we see around week 6 or 8, sometimes we see people really starting to, as their anxiety comes down, they start to feel other emotions that maybe have been suppressed for years. So we may see sadness or anger or any of those things. And actually we celebrate all the emotions, and it's a real important part of people's treatment to allow those emotions, often grief, a life, realizing the life that's been lost when they start to make improvements in their OCD or their BDD. And also they just, I guess all those things are part of the normal trajectory of someone's treatment. And all very key, you know.
There's so much to pick up on. So already when patients arrive, they get a glimpse of the future. They talk to Keith, and Keith can tell them, listen, I've been where you are, I didn't want to stay, and now look where I am now. So they can get that. It's very important, I think, when someone's dealing with a serious mental health problem or a serious problem, to have a long-term vision. So Keith can give them a long-term vision. And it just sounds like, when I'm here listening to you talking about the unit, there's so much attention to detail. There's so much thoughtfulness in every part of it. And it's very rare to see that in an inpatient unit of any kind. Mostly in the inpatient units that I've been in, what I've experienced is a lot of people who care a lot and work very hard, but the system design is perhaps over-medicalized and over-focused on things like risk, medical treatments, and let's say maintaining some sort of bureaucratic stability, all of which are important. But just listening to you talk, it just reveals all the other layers which we're missing. Helping people look after their bodies, helping people reconnect with their families, thinking about what's going to happen after they're discharged. And it's nice to hear about that. You mentioned that often when people start to address their anxiety disorders, there's like a layer underneath. And last week we released an episode with Rose Cartwright, author of the book Pure, who talked about this very thing, that for her it was a struggle to come to terms with her OCD, but even after she did, and she released a book about it and a TV show and all of that glamour, there were still important things to be reckoned with underneath in the form of trauma and things like that. So it's good to know that you guys are even taking care of that. And is that something that's been part of the unit's evolution, I suppose? Because maybe when it was initially conceived, it was all about the anxiety disorders themselves, but maybe you can tell me.
Yeah, I guess for many of our clients, they have had lots of CBT treatment in the past, right? So I think it's always important to be really curious about why that hasn't been effective. And what we see more and more is that many of our clients here have a lot of pain, and they've had maybe trauma in their backgrounds, and their best efforts at keeping themselves safe has meant that they've engaged with behaviours to avoid feeling that pain and that suffering. And it can sometimes be quite a revelation to clients that actually when they reduce their hand washing or their compulsions, whatever that may be, that actually other emotions start to rise to the surface. And that may be emotions linked in with past experiences of bullying or traumatic interactions in their early childhood, for a whole host of reasons. But I guess we have the opportunity here that by creating a safe environment, people feel that they can move towards that stuff that they may have shame around. And that's why I first became interested in compassion-focused therapy, for that very reason. And Paul Gilbert talks about it in his book, is that head-heart lag, that knowing logically maybe that something wasn't your fault, but not feeling it. So having that understanding that high levels of self-criticism and shame can be the blocker to feeling, that actually when we start doing compassion-focused therapy with our clients and we get them to talk out loud how they talk to themselves, that actually it's a very harsh environment internally. Yeah. And the relationship that they have with themselves is very judgmental, highly self-critical, and it's the longest relationship they'll have with anyone, and yet they berate themselves moment by moment. Yeah. And so that's just one aspect, and also the sense of shame and not feeling quite safe enough to share it with someone. And that's not often because they don't trust their therapist. It's like it's only an hour a week, so we have the opportunity to be with them for a lot longer. They build up that sense of trust. The therapeutic alliance feels quite strong, and when they notice other people that may have been here longer sharing their shame, it encourages them to share theirs. And also a lot of our clients have shame around their compulsions. They have shame around their intrusive thoughts. There's so much shame in their environment. They may have been shamed by the people that they live with and the environments that they belong to. And so they start to feel safe. And in those environments, they're able to share their shame. And I think that is a huge shift. And we feel very privileged to be in an environment where people do share their shame, and then we can work with that. Yeah,
I think shame is really interesting. I've done some DBT work. Sorry to interrupt. This is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. And as a fan of the show, I'd like to encourage you to follow and subscribe wherever you listen. If you like the show, you can share it with a friend. And if you'd like to support the team, you can buy them a coffee using the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes. As always, they'd love to hear from you. So if you have any feedback, you can follow them on social media, or you can email the team at podcast@modslearning.com. And one really interesting module in DBT, they talk about the function of different emotions, because we experience emotions a lot, but we don't talk about what they're for. And the function of shame is really interesting. Shame will arise if an individual gets the sense that they have violated the group's values and therefore that person is risking expulsion by the group or punishment by the group, which at some point during our evolutionary history is akin to death. You know, if you're expelled by the group or if the group sees you in a bad light. And so it's that inherent nature of shame is it makes you more isolated. But then by being more isolated, you only serve to reinforce whatever psychological difficulties that you may be experiencing. So it sounds like by sharing the shame, people are given kind of a release valve.
Absolutely.
And they can examine what's underneath. And I guess because everyone's coming from their own individual family systems where different things are valued, and some in dysfunctional family systems, the value systems will be dysfunctional. So they might feel shame around really inappropriate things like expressing oneself.
Absolutely.
For example, being angry. So you must see stuff like that all the time.
Definitely. And a lot of our clients have also emotionally parented themselves. And they haven't had a different perspective on those situations that have been placed in. And there's so much sort of I guess our language is very non-judgmental here. So we sort of frame coping strategies, your best efforts at keeping yourself safe.
Yeah.
In a moment where you felt unsafe, and felt threatened. And for many of our clients, they haven't got early memories of feeling soothed or cared for. So it's as if, if we say to them, start soothing yourself, it's like, well, I don't know what that means. So we start somewhere, and that starting somewhere is trying to build up a compassionate image, internal compassionate other that they are able to take around with them. I only did the group yesterday, and people talked about having a son, for example, or a stag, or it doesn't have to necessarily be of human.
So it's an image.
And it has all the qualities of a compassionate other. And I think when that becomes, sort of embedded, they're able to not feel so alone when they're going towards things that are really threatening. And they're able to use the language of that compassionate other to talk to them. And that may be really foreign and it might be really frightening, but we start slowly, and we build that up. And so there's a common language, which I think is really important. So all the residents come to the compassionate mind groups. They all start talking to each other like, that sounds a bit highly self-critical. Could you reframe that? They don't use the word reframe, but could you talk to yourself more compassionately? And all the staff and all the residents are sort of using that language, which I think is really helpful. Like for some people, they may use cats, they may use smell. It doesn't necessarily have to start with an image, but it's just about getting them into their soothing system.
It's like a way of grounding.
Yeah, a way of grounding, but also a way of offering yourself something that maybe you have never had an experience of, and sort of building up that sort of new neural pathway, I guess, if we were saying like that within the mind. Yeah.
If we can take a bit of a bird's eye view on anxiety. So people that come here, like you said, they'll have conditions like obsessive compulsive disorder, body dysmorphic disorder. If you guys want sort of an in-depth view on what those conditions are, we did a interview with David Veal, who is the consultant psychiatrist here.
Yeah.
So you guys can get a very in-depth look into those conditions. And you mentioned PTSD, and they all fall under this umbrella of anxiety. And I've been thinking recently about what anxiety is. And you mentioned that a lot of people who come here, they've had to parent themselves. And one way I've been thinking about anxiety recently is it's a taking of excessive responsibility, both for yourself, but also yourself projected through time. Like when you're anxious, you're trying to account for all the possibilities, for all the variables of everything that could conceivably go wrong. But there's too many possibilities, and it causes so much suffering. And one way I've been talking to peers and clients about anxiety is one way to soothe it is to kind of put faith in your future self, that you can handle it, rather than to try and account for all the different variables from right now and the present, because that's totally impossible.
Yeah, sure. I guess when we're thinking about developing our compassionate mind, we are thinking about the desire to acquire skills, wisdom and dedication and all those things. And there's a sense of strength and authority in that. I think when we think about compassion, often we think about it being weak or fluffy, but actually it's really blimmin' hard,
Yeah, I was just a guest on the Behind the Stigma podcast. Shout out to them. And we did an episode all about self-esteem and self-compassion. And something that I've found really effective is what you mentioned earlier. It's the combination of courage or challenge and compassion, because you kind of need both.
Yeah.
And I like to think of courage as a kind of paternal style of parenting, of like encouragement, go out, take risks, and compassion as a more maternal, more unconditional style of parenting. And like you said, many people think of compassion as corny, but if you combine compassion with challenging yourself, it's extremely effective, because you can rebound from challenges more easily. You can view situations as they are rather than catastrophizing. So you guys employ that combination a lot.
Absolutely. And we use the definition of compassion, which, you might be aware of, like having like the two psychologies of compassion. And the first is
I wasn't aware there were the two styles of compassion.
So the definition of compassion we use is a sensitivity to the suffering of self and others with a commitment to try and alleviate and prevent it.
Yeah.
And we talk about it in two psychologies. So basically, the first part is the awareness, or the moving towards our own suffering, the turning towards.
Right, the dropping resistance.
Yeah, and the turning towards all that's difficult in our lives and the lives of others. And then the second component is the desire to acquire skills, wisdom, and dedication to do something about it, for our own or other people's distress. Yeah. So the two psychologies, I guess, are really important. I mean, if you were going to Paul Gilbert uses the example of going to your doctor, falling over in the ice with a broken arm. And if he was just to validate your distress and say, oh, I can see you're in pain, that must be really tough. You'd be like, yeah, it is. But the second psychology is you want something. You want your doctor to be motivated to do something about it with wisdom and knowledge. And understanding. So those two psychologies are really important. One, it's like, okay, right, we're going to help our clients turn towards their pain or their suffering, but then really helping them to move towards and then do something about it.
So the first one is more about a acceptance of your situation, and then the second one is more pragmatic. How, on a practical level, how am I going to address this problem?
I think it's the curiosity to move towards that which is really painful, and that which we've avoided, and that which we've buried, or that which we've functioned alongside, and turning towards that is really, really hard. And I guess we wouldn't turn towards that and take off layers of armour, as it were, that's helped us cope in life, unless we've got new armour to put in its place. And maybe not armour the right word, but we want a compassionate cloak, I guess, to replace it. You wouldn't want to just take off the armour and just expose that person without then having something to replace it, which is compassion, which is that compassionate mind. All the breathing exercises, soothing rhythm breathing exercises we do, the compassionate imagery we do, the way of talking to ourselves, slowing down the tone, thinking about the nature of how we're talking to ourselves, and actually what we're actually saying, and being aware of that, and then trying to warm up those tones is really key to it all. But I guess the first stage is the awareness.
What you said reminded me of classical psychoanalysis, where people are talking to their analyst, and their defense mechanisms are being dismantled, whether their defense mechanisms like denial, rationalization, avoidance, whatever it is, obsessionality. And in classical psychoanalysis, the problem with it, I think, is you have to be quite robust for it, because they're called defense mechanisms for a reason. They're defending against something. And I think that's what classical analysis lacks, is it doesn't have that positive force, such as compassion, or even that practicality that, say, CBT has, to actually how you're going to construct your life so it's not so painful, so there's less to defend against. So that's quite interesting.
It is interesting, and I just think it's a gift. It's a gift that we give everyone in the community, both the staff and the residents. Is something that we all have. There's not one member of staff that hasn't been self-critical in one time in their life, or avoided, emotion. I think, some of my colleagues, and when we look at our own things that we've avoided, you go into the caring profession, and maybe the function of that going into a caring profession is that you don't have to look at your own stuff. So, compassionate mind training starts with us. We very much value starting from the inside out and being vulnerable ourselves and sharing that amongst the team, so that we've got an understanding of how difficult it is. So we're not asking our clients or residents to do something that we wouldn't be prepared to do ourselves. And so supervision is based on, of course, traditional supervision, but we also have supervision which looks at our own compassion for ourselves.
It makes sense. I think healthcare workers as healthcare workers as a group probably resemble people who might go on to develop obsessional thinking or anxiety, because we're often quite hardworking, perfectionistic, care a lot about detail, a sense of duty, a sense of getting things right, a sense of protecting against bad things happening. And yeah, I agree with you. I think self-critical thoughts and perfectionism in healthcare workers is very common, although it's probably part of everyone's life to some degree. We did an episode recently about perfectionism, which we've gotten quite good feedback for. But maybe you could tell me a bit about your own path. You know, how did you become a therapist? What interested you about it?
So, oh goodness me, lots of reasons really. I guess I first started out as a nurse. I used to work in care homes. I'd always had like a vision of helping people relieve their suffering, I guess. I was always sort of driven in that way. And so I did my nurse training, and then I worked in acute settings, and I worked all over. You know, you have the opportunity to do that.
Was that in South London mostly?
No, I'd worked. Where was my first job? My first job was at the National in Queen's Square.
Okay.
And I worked in neuropsychology there. And then when I moved out of London, I started working in a CAMS unit, and I couldn't bear it in some ways. I loved the caring and the talking to the children, but I felt it was very limited. I felt, you know, on this particular CAMS unit, I was looking at medication and restraint, you know, back in the day, and it broke my heart. It broke my heart. And when I started to look at the children's sort of formulation of their past, I could see that they'd had lots of episodes of really, really struggling. And we didn't really offer back then that much psychotherapy. It was very much, you know, the children were in their own rooms. It was very, you know, very not much exercise or any of those activities which would really help their mental health either. And I felt like a real need to move away from a medicalised model into something where I felt like I could really make a difference. I felt and I was both seeing the children, I guess, being medicated, but also seeing them as adults, you know, and felt like that it wasn't in line with my values at all.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people encounter this in mental health, but medicine more broadly, because we have images and fantasies of what being in healthcare is likely to be, and then you face stark realities when you start working. And I think it's good in the sense there's something about facing stark realities and seeing that it conflicts with your idealized version of what it is going to be. That's good for growth and maturity. But I think the problem is, for some people it's too much, and rather than moving from idealizing something to going to starting to grapple with reality, people become cynical and jaded.
Yeah. And I'd always had a rule for myself that the moment I became cynical and jaded, I had to get another job. That was my own sort of internal view. I wanted to be the best carer, because I'd throughout my life I'd gone to hospitals a lot, and I'd seen how nurses have worked, and I knew what I liked about nurses and what I found quite threatening about certain care, and I really had that value for myself. So I trained in CBT, an amazing course at Salomons at Canterbury, Christchurch University, and my first job was working in IAPT, actually, in the Medway towns, and I had a real sort of, I don't know, I really enjoyed, I don't know whether enjoyment is the right word, but I enjoyed helping people with post-traumatic stress. We had a lot in our service in the Medway towns, either people that come through the service, ex-service personnel,
veterans,
or or people with, you know, trauma or car accidents, a whole host. But I ended up seeing more and more people with post-traumatic stress disorder, and I felt like my training had been brilliant, but I felt like I needed more in-depth supervision. And so I wrote to the Centre for Anxiety and Trauma, and wrote to Nick Gray on Feeling One Brave one lunchtime, and said, could I do 1 day a week with you and work within your service? And I received such amazing supervision. But I kept coming up across this thing where, like, that head, heart, lag thing with clients with PTSD, like they said, Lisa, I know this stuff. I know it wasn't my fault, but I just don't feel it. So I kept bringing that to supervision, and Nick said, actually, I think you would really like the compassion course with Paul Gilbert. So then I applied to do, even though I vowed to myself I wasn't going to do any more training.
Yeah.
I was going to give myself a bit of a break. I went up to Derby University and did the compassion focused therapy training as a postgrad, and it changed my life. And what was so important about that is a very small group, but we had to work on ourselves first, you know. And
so when you were doing CBT training, there was less focus on work personal growth.
Absolutely, unless you paid for it privately.
You didn't have to be in therapy.
You didn't have to be in therapy yourself. Of course, our supervisors were amazing, and there was lots that came up in supervision because it touched on things that were personal to you. Yeah. However, it was very different from having your own personal therapy. And
maybe we could, before we move on to compassion-focused therapy, let's talk a bit about CBT. What are like the strengths of CBT? Where is CBT at its best?
Well, considering, I just think a lot of people with mental health issues haven't got the money to pay privately for therapy. And I think one of the biggest things that IAPT has done is it's allowed people to access therapy free at the point of delivery. And that has changed, you know, the sort of structure of mental health, I guess, in the country, and it's been incredible. So if people know about it, that's the only thing, you know, you have to know about it. And there's lots of barriers, of course, for many people to access it. Don't get me wrong, there's a portion of the society that probably don't get to access it, and that's a real shame. And I think,
is that because of waiting lists or other reasons?
There may be some sort of community reasons around, you know, maybe not accessing it, maybe difficulty to be able to get there. Pre-COVID, don't forget, a lot of it was face-to-face. And I think, you know, some of the benefits of COVID and moving online is that it's maybe a lot of people are able to access it if they've got a computer or a smartphone. So there's still a section of the population that, you know, my parents hate smartphones and computers, so they'd struggle if that was all that was offered. But I guess the knowledge that you can go to your GP and say I'm really struggling, and actually there to be something free to access is great. So I think for CBT that's been amazing. And also that it's evidence-based practice, where actually, you know, we know that actually CBT is really effective for anxiety disorders and depression, and people feel quite contained in that. They're knowing they're getting something that is by registered therapists. And yes, it's, you know, potentially it's short-term treatment. However, there's a lot of people in the population that don't benefit from short-term CBT, and there's a huge gap that, you know, needs to get talked about, but that's another podcast, isn't it?
What does CBT do? So someone has, let's say, mild to moderate anxiety or depression, and how does CBT help them?
So I guess CBT really allows people to, we use the word formulation, but, you know, get a map of what is maintaining their fear, maybe. So people may, you know, the first time when people talk out loud, how they're talking to themselves, or the thoughts that they're struggling with, and how those thoughts affect how they feel and their behaviour. I think when that starts to get mapped out and it comes out of their mind onto a piece of paper, and then you've got somebody sitting opposite you that really understands what's maintaining that problem, and that some of your solutions may be causing your problems, then it's like, there's like an aha moment. Okay, so if these things are maintaining the problem, then maybe we can work together to sort of to reduce those maintenance cycles, as it were, to stop.
That's really interesting. Some of your solutions are causing your problems. Could you give me an example of that?
So I guess you don't get to test out your greatest fears. So, you know, say if you feared, a good example is we have a death day here, which is where we explore death anxiety and death. And people get to talk about loved ones. They talk about their own funeral and how they'd like to be remembered. So one of the things we did a couple of weeks ago was writing on a board, you know, I wish that I use my son, I wish that my son Ben would die in a horrific car accident by 12 o'clock this evening.
Wow.
It's huge. I find it a real struggle every single time.
So you're confronting that.
But you're confronting your fear, right? So you're confronting the belief that actually, if I was to write that down, it's going to actually happen, you know? Yeah. And actually by writing it down and you discover nothing's going to happen, it takes the power out of what you're doing.
Yes.
So in CBT terms, you're sort of confronting your fear and you're discovering something else. And it's that curiosity around that and being able to sit with that, I wanted to go and rub it off the board. I wanted to, let's be truthful, I wanted to offer up, an uncle that had already died, you can find all these ways to avoid that, because it's important to choose something that we'd all struggle with.
Choose something you're actually afraid of.
Yeah. And move towards it. And discover something new, and be curious about, okay, I will do that thing, and what do I think is going to happen? Like really scientifically testing it out. And I think it's very concrete, and you can see, actually, if I do that thing and that's my fear, and that fear doesn't happen, oh my goodness, maybe I don't have to do those behaviours,
Yeah, I like to use examples of people with social anxiety. Say you feel anxious about socializing, and that prevents you from going out, say, to a party or to a work do or whatever. And even though that makes you feel safe in the short term, in the long term, it makes you feel more worried about socializing in the future, because the way I like to think about it, your mind is taking cues from your behavior as to what to be afraid of and what not to. So Pete doesn't go to the party, and your brain's like, well, Pete's not going to the party. The party must be a threat. So the next time that opportunity arises, that fear response kicks in even stronger. And on top of that, it's compounded by the fact that socializing is a set of skills. So those skills continue to degrade. So on the rare opportunities you do socialize, you're not getting positive social signals back, and it becomes a downward spiral. But I guess in CBT, you're deconstructing that and reversing it to create an upward spiral, getting positive feedback from the world, positive messages to yourself, and reversing that process.
And also we got the opportunity to repeat and repeat and repeat again. So,
putting in the reps.
Yeah. So, people get really afraid of doing something. They sit on the floor for the first time, or they take their shoes off and walk across the grass, right? So they've done it. There's a huge relief. Oh my goodness, I've done that thing. But actually the most important thing is the repetition of it, to keep discovering that bad thing doesn't happen is really key. And I guess we got the opportunity to do that because people are here for 16 weeks, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. We're doing, every day is an exposure, really, because they're setting up in the morning their daily intention. What am I going to do today that is going to move me towards a valued life, One
of my favorite things about practicing therapy, I practice humanistic, but I use exposure techniques, and I guess if you had to straw man psychotherapy, the sort of caricature of it is it's all talking and no action, and it might take a very long time to work. But I love exposure techniques because there's that instant, oh my God, I was really afraid. Then I tried confronting a small version of that thing I was afraid of, and I immediately feel better, and I feel more courageous, and I feel tougher. And I think it's one of the most reliable, robust responses you can get in therapy.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a very active therapy, and people really benefit from that. And we're not only the grounds, but we do an out and about every week. So we go out into London, and that's challenging for so many reasons. Central London. We don't always go to central London. We've been to Brighton. We've been to lovely places outside. But really, it's all with a CBT focus. Yeah. So it's okay, right? The journey. Sitting on a public transport, holding a door open, touching a road crossing, using a public toilet in Charing Cross Station. These are huge things for a lot of our clients. But we're able to support them in that. But not just an individual therapy. They've got the support of the whole community, knowing that that's what they're doing, that they're going to go to a public toilet, they're going to sit on a public toilet, and they're going to stay there for like 10 minutes maybe to test out their greatest fear. And when they come out and they've done it, and they'll get that sort of positive reward in that moment, and then they share it the next day, it encourages people to do it again. And there's shared laughter. A lot of it is not like all gritting your teeth. A lot of it's playful. There's a real community focus, and there's a coming together with that. People take photos of what they've done. They can't quite believe it. And so there may be laughter and joyfulness. There may be sadness. So all of the emotions are just as important. Yeah.
So we've talked about some of the strengths of CBT. Then what are CBT's weaknesses? Where is it not so effective, do you think?
Well, I can only talk from here. I think CBT has got a massive role to play, but I believe it's really important to do compassion focused therapy alongside it. Yeah, because In longer term therapy using CBT much longer, then you have the ability to go longitudinal. You go back into maybe some of the reasons why somebody may have found they felt themselves to be unsafe in the past, and why their threat system is probably ruling the show, or their coping strategies are there at some point to keep them safe. But to have an understanding of how that felt, and did you have your emotional needs met at the time, we have the opportunity to go back. CBT was set up really to be quite present focused, although we do think about longitudinal, but in primary care it would be, you haven't got enough time to do all of it, so you focus on the maintenance cycle and it's quite present focused. So it really does have a place. We are a CBT service. It really does have a place, and we feel very strongly about that. But I guess we hold it within the hands of compassion.
Right.
And that's important. To be able to do both those things is key, I think.
Yeah. So you can almost picture someone's anxiety, maybe their low mood, intrusive thoughts, sort of all orbiting a wound.
Yeah.
And maybe CBT helps you deconstruct those outer layers, the thoughts, the worries, the mood. And then once you deconstruct them with CBT, underlying it is the wound. And that might be difficulties with parents, some sort of trauma, something like that. And that's what compassion can address more directly.
Yeah. Because I guess, having worked in IAP, CBT, short-term therapy, is extremely effective for a lot of people. But here we're at, there's severe mental health, that people have struggled for years with their OCD or their BDD. Yeah. They've had, 2 maybe treatment failures already of CBT. So there's something about pure just CBT on its standalone that maybe that hasn't worked. And we need to be really curious about that. About what it was, about that experience that maybe hasn't worked out for you.
So for patients to come here, do they have to have had a certain amount of treatment that failed?
For many of our clients, they will have had 2 treatment failures in CBT that haven't been successful. They will also have been on certain types of medication, maybe antipsychotics as well, to access our service, and be in the severe range on the Y box, which is the way we measure severity of OCD or body dysmorphia.
Yeah. And what role does medication play here? Are most patients on medication? Are there any who aren't on any medication? How does it work?
Yeah, so the majority of clients, residents that come here are taking medication. They may have their medication altered slightly, because I guess we've got specialists within our team that are probably more aware of the effects of certain medications with, say, BDD or OCD, and our doctors work with our residents really closely. And then there's some people that are unable to take medication because they've had reactions to that medication. And so they may have demonstrated that they've tried to take a certain medication and it hasn't helped them.
So some wouldn't be on any medication?
Yeah, some wouldn't be on any medication, yeah.
Yeah. And do you guys measure your outcomes, people improving and things along those lines?
Yeah, so we actually take psychological measures throughout their treatment. And then we actually we see people 1 month, 2 months and 3 months for follow-ups, which is
after they get
discharged and they come back. So that's lovely. We get to see them again. But also we have what's called a reconnection day once a year. So we invite the last 100 people that have been through our service back for a day on a Saturday generally. We haven't been able to do it because of COVID recently, but that is, a qualitative measurement of seeing how people are getting on. And because we get to know them and their families and often their communities, we hear a lot from our ex-residents. They keep us informed. They send us postcards to how they're doing. And also we get ex-residents to come back, not only Keith, but we get ex-residents to come back to talk to our current residents about their treatment progress and actually things that they've struggled with since leaving here, things that have worked out well. So we, only last month I saw somebody that I treated 4 years ago who came back. She now works in the Met Police, and she came back to talk to our residents about her BDD and how it affected her whilst she was here, but how she's then gone on to make huge improvements in her life.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds, like I said before, it's like everything is thought of, and it's nice to see. It feels like kind of an oasis, within NHS mental health services. Do you feel like it is?
Absolutely. And I think so much of therapy is about the therapeutic alliance, that you have with your clients. And I know that when I've been in appointments in hospital and stuff like that, I'm making very quick fire decisions about the person that's sitting in front of me, and it's not their fault, but if they're really stressed, they can be quite shut down facially, or their posture or whatever. And that can be interpreted as quite threatening. And so I'm really interested in that. So what we're trying to do is create a culture where our therapists and our staff team feel psychologically safe. So actually, when clients come to see them, they feel relaxed, I guess, and their body posture and their eye contact and all of those things that make you feel safe. And there's evidence to show that that's important, and that reciprocity is important. That if we can foster that in our environment by encouraging the whole community to attend yoga twice a week, which we do.
And the whole community, including staff,
all the admin staff, the housekeeper, everyone.
Wow.
And that we do that. It's 2 hours out of a week. And it makes a huge impact on everybody. That we all go to a community meeting, the whole team, that's everyone, the residents and the staff. That we have shared lunches, that we go and play badminton outside with our clients. All of these things is about ourselves. And if we can be the best version of ourselves as caring professionals, then the environment we're creating is a safe one. And people are able to more go towards those places that they find difficult because they feel safe.
Yeah. I think that another huge problem that we have in mental health services is there's this isolation between staff and patients and distance. And I guess part of that is the need to be professional, which is important. But the counter to that is a lot of what works in therapy or in mental health settings is like an implicit message, an implicit modeling of what good mental health looks like, which is hard to do if patients are seeing this incredibly stoic, detached figure. Again, going back to classical psychoanalysis, it's very, it can probably reinforce a lot of the neuroses that they're suffering with in the first place.
Absolutely. And I think it's, we're all suffering.
Yeah, we're all, it's
universal, that sense of common humanity, that we all have, a mind that we didn't create, that was built for us, not by us. And we all have these tricky loops that we get into, and my mind and the way those tricky loops are in my mind, that threat focus, better safe than sorry mentality that every human has, we all share that, And so it's not like I've got my life sorted because I'm sitting in a position of being a therapist and you haven't. So
we're all a work in progress.
We're all a work in progress. Yeah. And I think the definition, I read somewhere that the definition of patient is someone who suffers, So actually, in fact, in some ways, we're all patients.
We're all patients.
Yeah.
And I think one of the biggest traps people fall into when they are struggling, and I think social media amplifies this, is they look at people who are quote unquote successful, and there's this illusion that they're somehow cut from a different cloth, and success or happiness or let's say a good quality of life, it's for them, but it's not for me. I.e., I'm fundamentally different from them. Whereas actually, what you can create with this kind of work culture you're describing is a sense of solidarity of, we're all at different points, but we all struggle with things to different intensities, but a lot of the struggles have the same character and the solutions are the same for everyone.
Absolutely that. And it's a great place to start, isn't it? Because it's sort of, there's a sense of, okay, right, we've got a really good starting point as a community.
Yeah. And social media really amplifies it because you're just like, for the first time in human history, you can go and take a look into the day-to-day lives of, let's say, the top 1% of our society. You can go, what did Jay-Z do this morning? But the problem is, it's not. It's very curated, because they're only going to present the best of what their lives have to offer. But actually, if you were even to go to these hyper successful people and be inside their head, God knows what you'd find. And the TV show White Lotus, which just came out, is all about this, all about how huge amounts of wealth, like even getting hugely wealthy, not only does it not shelter you from neurotic patterns, but it gives them a space for them to be amplified and get worse.
Definitely. And there's I haven't watched that yet, but I will do. But it's interesting, isn't it, that we're more industrialized, and the more successful we become as a country, success in inverted commas, the more isolated we become. So there's that sense of loss of community as we've become more developed. And that statistic about more people dying from loneliness and cigarette smoke is horrific. And many of our clients are extremely isolated. By the time they've come here, many of them have not worked for years or have never worked. They've lost family members due to their OCD or their BDD, or they're just sitting isolated in their room because they can't leave their room because of their contamination fears, for example. And so it's a very frightening, lonely existence. And I guess they come to ADRU and they experience something else. And then when you start to look at their interests outside of their OCD or their BDD, and we celebrate that, and we get people like today, they've just been to the gym and they've been playing badminton. For many of them, they haven't done exercise for a long time in that way. And there's a sense of, they're getting a sense of joy from those moments. And then when we look with the occupational therapy to how they can then extend that past ADRU into their own communities, then it starts to change the relationships they have with themselves, but each other and their communities. So the benefits of all of it is so sort of wide ranging, and wide reaching.
They start to get a glimpse of what their life could look like.
Yeah.
Beyond the pain that they've been experiencing before.
Yeah. I mean, they know that we hold them in mind, and I think there's a real sense of that people sometimes, a couple of years down the line, we're not offering them therapy again, but they might ring up and say, I'm really struggling. Can I just talk you through, I've lost someone in my family, for example, and I'm feeling really sad. Lisa, can I just speak to you about that? And of course, we speak to them about that. And then we might never hear from them again for ever, or not for a number of years. But I think for many of our clients, what's really sad about the current crisis is that they're going back into homes where they may not get the support in their local teams, because local teams are so stretched, and so that the support that used to be there is no longer there. So they're really up against it in their home environments. So they may have made all this progress, but actually the support, I think, is key, and yet that doesn't seem to be. It seems to be a bit of a postcode lottery. And I think it's getting worse.
If what advice would you give if someone was isolating, struggling with something like anxiety, be it in the form of OCD or otherwise? What advice would you give that person?
I guess for those, I would say that there is help out there for you, that you do not have to go through this alone, that there are people now specialised in what you're suffering with that can help you for free, and you don't even have to go to your GP. For many IAPT services, you can look up IAPT, you can look in your local area, and there's a free phone number often, and you can ring them. So you don't actually have to present at your GP that you may have shame about. It might be easier to talk to somebody on the phone. And I would reach out, because there are people out there that can really help you. And
are there any books that you would recommend on CBT or compassion-focused therapy?
Oh, where do I start? So I guess David Veal, who's our consultant, has written a number of books on OCD and BDD. The Overcoming series is really good. Break Free from OCD by Victoria Bream Oldfield. Paul Sarkovskis is really good. I'm really sorry if I've missed your name out. And with the compassion-focused therapy, of course, there's Paul Gilbert's seminal book, but since then...
what is that called? Compassion-focused therapy?
Compassionate Minds.
Compassionate Minds. Yeah.
But, since then, there's Deborah Lee, who's written Compassionate Mind for Post-Traumatic Stress and Trauma. Mary Welford, wonderful woman, who's started the first compassion school in Saltash in Cornwall, has written about compassion for self-confidence. Chris Irons has now released an app, which is really quite reasonable. It's quite cheap. And in there's the whole Compassionate Mind series, but also as like supportive text online. And he's written a number of books on compassionate mind for depression, etc. There's lots of books out there. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, Lisa, it's been lovely to talk with you and learn more about this unit. I'm sure that there's a lot to be learned, and hopefully there'll be opportunities for whatever you guys have got going here in terms of the culture and the practices, for it to become hopefully more widespread in the future. I do think there is a growing hunger amongst the general population for a more holistic view and treatment of mental health conditions, and it seems like now the gap is how does it filter through to the NHS, to the large bureaucratic system. But hopefully in this process we can look at this unit as an amazing example of that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been wonderful talking to you. Thanks so much.
If you enjoy the podcast, we'd love it if you shared it with a friend, or if you gave us a rating on either Spotify or Apple. And if you fancy it, you can even buy us a coffee, and all the links for that will be online. Thanks again.